You can have 20 degrees on the wall and still miss what the heart is trying to say. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the sterile, white hallway like a quiet truth no one was ready to hear. Just hours earlier, that same hallway had echoed with something very different. Heels clicking fast, voices sharp with urgency, machines beeping in steady, indifferent rhythms. 20 doctors had come and gone through room 314 at St. Matthew's Medical Center, each with polished credentials, each with confident hands, and yet none of them had answers. Inside that room lay a girl no older than 12, pale against crisp white sheets, her small fingers curled loosely as if still holding on to something only she could see. Her name was Emily Vance, daughter of one of the most powerful billionaires in America, a man whose name opened doors, built cities, and commanded silence in boardrooms. But here, in this room, his power meant nothing. The machines didn't care about wealth. The silence around his daughter didn't negotiate. And for the first time in his life, Richard Vance stood helpless, his tailored suit wrinkled from hours of pacing, his eyes hollow from nights without sleep. "There has to be something you're missing," he said, his voice strained, not angry anymore, just tired. The lead physician adjusted his glasses, choosing his words carefully. "We've run every test available. Neurological scans, blood panels, genetic markers. There's no trauma, no infection, no clear diagnosis. We're doing everything we can." Everything. It sounded like a lot, but it felt like nothing. Richard looked at his daughter again, remembering the last time she had laughed, the way her voice filled their home, light and effortless. Now there was only stillness. Across the hall, unnoticed by most, a man pushed a mop slowly across the polished floor. His name tag read Daniel Brooks. Mid-30s. Worn work boots. Faded uniform. To the hospital staff, he was just the janitor, the quiet single dad who worked double shifts and kept his head down. But Daniel didn't rush. He never did. Every movement was steady, deliberate, like a man who had learned long ago that chaos only grows louder when you chase it. "Hey, Daniel," a nurse called casually as she passed. "Long night." He gave a small nod. "They all are." It was the kind of answer that didn't invite more questions. And that was fine with him, because outside of these walls, his world was much smaller, but no less heavy. A small apartment on the edge of town. A 7-year-old daughter who waited up too late just to say goodnight. A stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. And a promise he had made to himself after everything fell apart, that no matter how hard life got, he would remain steady, remain kind, remain quiet. Back in the hallway, the tension shifted as another specialist arrived, flipping through charts, speaking in clipped, confident tones. "We'll try a different approach," he said. "Adjust the treatment protocol. There's still a chance." But hope, in that room, had started to feel like something fragile, something that kept breaking the moment it was touched. Daniel paused his mop just outside room 314. He didn't mean to listen. He never pried. But sometimes silence has a way of pulling you closer. He glanced through the small glass window. He saw the girl. He saw the father. And something in his expression changed. Not curiosity, not pity, but recognition. The kind that doesn't come from textbooks or titles. The kind that comes from having stood on the edge of losing everything and learning how to see what others overlook. He lowered his gaze, dipping the mop back into the bucket, the water rippling softly under the fluorescent lights. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Sometimes the problem isn't what's broken, it's what's being ignored." And no one in that hallway, not the doctors, not the nurses, not even the billionaire standing beside his daughter, had any idea that the quiet man with the mop had just taken the first step toward a truth that would soon leave the entire hospital in stunned silence. "You said you've tried everything, but did anyone ask why she stopped fighting?" Daniel's voice came quietly, almost respectfully, yet it cut through the tension like a thread pulled loose from a perfect suit. The nurse nearest the door blinked, surprised. "Sir, this is a restricted area," she said, her tone polite but firm. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't step forward either. He simply stood there, hands resting lightly on the mop handle, posture calm, eyes steady. "I'm not here to interfere," he said. "Just notice something." Inside the room, Richard Vance turned, irritation flickering across his face before settling into something colder. And what exactly would a janitor notice that 20 specialists didn't? 3 quick words followed. sharp and dismissive. This isn't your place. The room tightened. A monitor beeped steadily. A doctor cleared his throat. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, not in submission, but in restraint. Then he spoke again, slower this time. You're right. It's not my place. He paused, the silence stretching just long enough to be felt. But she didn't get worse all at once, did she? The lead physician frowned slightly. Her condition progressed over several weeks. Daniel nodded once. And before that, something changed. No one answered immediately. The doctors exchanged brief glances. Richard's jaw tightened. We've reviewed her history thoroughly, he said. School records, medical reports, everything. Daniel's grip on the mop shifted, subtle, controlled. Records don't always show what people hide. 2 sentences of quiet observation. Then the turn. The nurse hesitated. Actually, there was a note, she said, flipping through the chart. A behavioral change. Withdrawal. Loss of appetite. Sleep disturbances. The physician waved it off lightly. Stress response. Not uncommon. Daniel didn't move. Stress doesn't usually shut a kid down like that unless it's been building for a while. The room fell into a softer kind of silence now. Not disbelief. Not acceptance. Something in between. Richard stepped closer, his voice lower, more dangerous. Are you suggesting we've missed something obvious? Daniel met his gaze for the first time, not challenging, not afraid. Just steady. I'm suggesting she might be telling you something, just not in a way you're trained to hear. That landed differently. No raised voices. No dramatic shift. Just a small fracture in certainty. A doctor exhaled slowly. We deal in evidence, he said. Not guesses. Daniel gave a faint nod. So do I. He glanced once more through the glass at Emily. Her stillness too complete, too quiet. That's not a body giving up, he added softly. That's a body protecting itself. The words lingered. Not loud. Not forceful. But they didn't fade. Richard looked back at his daughter, something unfamiliar creeping into his expression. Not hope. Not yet. But doubt in everything he thought he understood. If you have something to say, he said finally, voice tight, say it clearly. Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. Not because he didn't know, but because he understood the weight of being heard. When someone shuts down like that, he said, choosing each word with care, it's usually because something inside feels unsafe, even if everything outside looks perfect. A nurse shifted uncomfortably. One of the doctors crossed his arms. Psychosomatic, he asked. We've considered it. Daniel shook his head slightly. Not just in the mind. In the whole system. Like it's trying to survive something it can't escape. 3 short sentences. 2 quiet observations. 1 turning point. Richard's voice dropped to almost a whisper. She has everything, he said. The best schools. The safest home. The best care money can buy. Daniel didn't interrupt. He let the words settle. Then, gently, he answered. Sometimes, that's exactly why no one notices what's missing. And for the first time since the doctors had arrived, no one reached for a chart. No one checked a monitor. No one spoke. Because something deeper than medicine had just entered the room, and it didn't come with a title. If it's not her body, then what is it? The question came quietly, almost reluctantly, as if speaking it out loud might make it more real. Richard Vance stood at the foot of the hospital bed, his hand resting on the cold metal rail, his eyes fixed on his daughter like he was trying to will her back through sheer force of presence. No one answered him right away. The doctors shifted, exchanging looks that carried more uncertainty than they wanted to admit. Daniel didn't step closer. He didn't need to. Sometimes, he said, voice. Low and even. When a child feels like they can't be heard, they stop trying. 3 short sentences hung in the air. A machine beeped. A nurse adjusted in 4-line that didn't need adjusting. Then the silence deepened. That's not a diagnosis. One of the physicians muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Daniel nodded slightly. No, sir. It's not. 2 calm acknowledgments. Then the shift. It's a starting point. Richard exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. For a man used to controlling outcomes, this felt like standing in the middle of a storm with nothing to hold on to. And what would you have us do? He asked, not mocking this time, but not trusting either. Daniel glanced once more at Emily, then back at the father. Listen differently. That was it. No lecture. No long explanation. Just 3 words that carried more weight than any chart in the room. Hours later, the hallway had quieted. The rush of specialists had faded into a low hum of distant footsteps and muffled conversations. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting that same steady glow that never changed, no matter how much life shifted beneath it. Daniel finished his shift like he always did, methodical, quiet, unnoticed. But something followed him out of that building. Not pride, not expectation, just a familiar heaviness, the kind that comes when you recognize pain you can't fully fix. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain on asphalt. He drove home in silence, the city lights passing in blurred reflections across his windshield. No music, no distractions, just thought. By the time he reached his apartment, the clock read a little past 9:30 p.m. The hallway outside his unit was dim, the paint chipped in places, the kind of place people pass through without really seeing. He unlocked the door quietly. "Daddy?" A small voice called from the living room. 3 quick steps. A pause. Then softer. "You're late." Daniel stepped inside, setting his keys gently on the counter. "I know, sweetheart." His daughter, Lily, sat curled up on the couch, her schoolbook open but forgotten in her lap. She was 7, small for her age, with tired eyes that had learned patience too early. "I waited," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Daniel crouched beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You always do." 2 soft sentences. Then the moment that mattered. "Did something happen at school today?" Lily hesitated. Just for a second. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the book. "No," she said. Too quickly. Daniel didn't correct her. Didn't push. He simply nodded, like he believed her completely. "Okay." That was all. No pressure. No interrogation. Just space. Lily looked at him, confusion flickering across her face. "You're not going to ask again?" she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. "You'll tell me when you're ready." And just like that, something in her shoulders loosened. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to stay open. Back in the hospital, miles away, Emily Vance lay in the same stillness, surrounded by machines, by experts, by answers that weren't answers. But in that small apartment, under dim light and quiet understanding, a different kind of truth was unfolding. One built not on knowledge, but on patience. Not on control, but on trust. And somewhere between those two worlds, unseen but already moving, was the fragile beginning of something the doctors had missed entirely. "You said she'll speak when she's ready, but what if she never is?" The question came softly, almost swallowed by the quiet of the hospital room, but it carried the weight of a man who was running out of time to believe in anything he couldn't control. It was early morning now, the kind of gray light that slipped through the blinds without warmth, settling over everything like a reminder that the night hadn't solved anything. Richard Vance hadn't left. His jacket was draped over the chair, his tie loosened, his posture no longer sharp but worn down by hours of watching, waiting, hoping for a change that never came. Emily lay exactly as she had the night before. Still, quiet, unreachable. A nurse adjusted the monitor, her movements careful, almost reverent. "She's stable," she said gently. "No decline." 3 words that should have comforted. 2 that didn't. Richard nodded, but his eyes never moved from his daughter. "Stable isn't living," he murmured. Across the hall, the day's shift began to take over. New footsteps, new voices, the rhythm of the hospital resetting itself like nothing had happened. Daniel stepped through the entrance a few minutes later, his uniform clean but worn, his expression the same steady calm he carried every day. "Morning," a receptionist greeted. He nodded once. "Morning." 3 short exchanges. Routine. Predictable. Then the shift. As he moved down the hallway, his eyes instinctively found room 314. He didn't stop right away. He never rushed toward anything that mattered. Instead, he continued past, pushing his cart, listening, not just to the sounds, but to the absence between them. When he finally turned back, the door was slightly open. Inside, Richard stood by the window now, arms crossed, staring out at nothing in particular. "You came back," he said without turning. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the cart handle. "I work here." A simple answer. No weight added. No meaning forced. Richard let out a quiet breath. "That's not what I meant." 2 seconds passed. Then honesty slipped through. "I kept thinking about what you said." Daniel stepped just inside the doorway, careful, respectful of the space. "And Richard turned slowly, his face tired but sharper now, like something inside him had shifted overnight. I don't know how to listen to something that isn't speaking. 3 words earlier had planted doubt. Now it had grown into a question. Daniel nodded slightly. Most people don't. 2 calm acknowledgements. Then the turn. But kids, they don't stop communicating. They just change how they do it. Richard frowned, his mind trying to catch up to something that didn't fit into logic. You're saying this is a choice? Daniel shook his head immediately. No, sir. His voice stayed steady. I'm saying it's a response. The difference landed quietly, but it landed. A doctor entered briefly, flipping through the chart. We're scheduling another round of imaging this afternoon, he said. Just to be thorough. Richard nodded automatically, but his attention had already shifted elsewhere. Daniel glanced at Emily again, then back to the father. Can I ask you something? Richard hesitated, then gave a short nod. Go ahead. Daniel's voice softened, not weaker, just more careful. When was the last time she felt like she could disappoint you and still be okay? The question didn't hit like an accusation. It settled like something heavier. Richard's expression tightened. I've given her everything, he said, almost defensively. The best education, the best opportunities, I don't doubt that. Daniel interrupted gently, not dismissing, just redirecting. 2 sentences. Then the shift. But did she feel safe being anything less than perfect? Silence followed. Not the kind filled with noise, but the kind that forces memory to speak. Richard looked at his daughter again, really looked this time. Not as a patient, not as a problem to solve, but as a child who had once laughed, once failed, once needed reassurance. And for the first time, something inside him didn't feel like control slipping away. It felt like understanding trying to break through. Daniel stepped back slightly, giving the moment space. Because sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stop filling the silence long enough for the truth to finally be heard. You can't fix what you don't see, and you can't see what no one feels safe to show. The words lingered in Richard Vance's mind long after they were spoken, echoing louder than any medical explanation he had heard in the past 48 hours. He stood beside his daughter's bed, but something inside him had shifted, just slightly, just enough to make him question not the doctors, but himself. The room was quieter now. No specialists, no rushing footsteps, just the soft rhythm of machines and the faint hum of the hospital waking into another day. Emily hadn't moved. Not a finger, not a breath out of pattern. But for the first time, Richard wasn't just watching her condition. He was searching for something deeper. Emily, he said softly, his voice unfamiliar even to himself. Not commanding, not instructing, just calling. There was no response. But he didn't stop. You don't have to be strong right now. 3 short sentences. No pressure. No expectation. Then silence. Across the hallway, Daniel worked quietly, his movements steady as always, but his mind wasn't entirely on the floor beneath him. It rarely was when something unfinished lingered. Hey, you okay? Another janitor asked, leaning against a supply cart. Daniel nodded once. Yeah. A pause. Then honest, but simple. Just thinking. He didn't explain further. He never did. Because some things weren't meant to be explained in passing. Back at home, miles away, Lily sat in her classroom, her small hands folded neatly on her desk while the other kids talked too loudly, laughed too easily, lived in a world that didn't always make space for quiet children. Lily, do you want to share your drawing? The teacher asked gently. Lily shook her head quickly. No, thank you. 3 soft words. Polite. Controlled. Then the moment that mattered. The teacher smiled, but there was a flicker of something else, uncertainty, maybe even misunderstanding. You should try, she encouraged. It's really good. Lily's fingers tightened slightly around the paper. I'm okay, she said again, softer this time. And just like that, the moment passed. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't feel safe enough to say it. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat across from her at their small kitchen table, a simple dinner between them, the kind that didn't need words to feel full. How was school? He asked, his tone light, unforced. Lily shrugged. It was fine. 2 words. Familiar. Practiced. Daniel nodded, taking a slow sip of water. He didn't challenge it. Didn't dig. You don't have to tell me everything, he said calmly. Just the parts that matter to you. 3 sentences. Gentle. Open. Then silence. Lily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to understand something she hadn't been taught in school. "What if it's not a big thing?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Those are usually the biggest ones." That landed. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Lily hesitated, then slowly turned the paper toward him. It was a drawing, simple, uneven lines, but full of care. A small house, two figures holding hands, and in the corner, a third figure, standing just outside. "She didn't want to sit with us," Lily whispered. Daniel studied the drawing, not rushing to respond, not minimizing, not fixing. "That probably hurt," he said softly. Lily nodded, just once, and something in her shoulders relaxed, like a weight she didn't know she was carrying had finally been acknowledged. Back in the hospital, Richard Vance stood in the same room, facing the same silence, but now, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something waiting, something fragile, something that needed the right kind of presence, not pressure. And without realizing it, in two completely different worlds, two fathers were learning the same truth. One through quiet practice, the other through painful awakening. That being heard isn't about volume, it's about safety. And until that safety exists, even the loudest voices in the world can go completely silent. She doesn't need another test, she needs a reason to come back. The sentence wasn't spoken loudly, but it settled into the room with a weight that no machine could measure. Richard Vance stood motionless, his eyes locked on his daughter as if the answer might be written somewhere between her stillness and his own reflection. The morning had stretched into afternoon, and with it came more procedures, more scans, more quiet reassurances that sounded increasingly hollow. "We'll begin imaging in 10 minutes, the doctor said, glancing at his watch. "It's important we rule everything out." 3 clinical sentences. Efficient, controlled. Then the silence that followed. Richard nodded, but slower this time, like the motion itself carried doubt. "And if you don't find anything?" he asked. The doctor hesitated, just briefly. "Then we continue exploring possibilities." It was the right answer. It just wasn't the one a father needed. Across the room, Daniel stood near the doorway, not interrupting, not inserting himself, just present, watching, listening, waiting for the moment that mattered. "Mr. Vance," he said gently. Richard turned, not annoyed this time, not dismissive, just tired enough to hear. "What?" 3 letters. No defense, no ego. Daniel stepped a little closer, his voice steady. "What if the more you try to fix her, the more she feels like something's wrong with her?" 2 sentences. Soft, careful, then the shift. "What if she doesn't need to be fixed?" The doctor frowned. "With all due respect, that's not how medicine works." Daniel nodded immediately. "I understand." No resistance, no challenge. Then the truth slipped in quietly. But kids don't live in systems. They live in feelings. That lingered. Richard looked back at Emily, his mind replaying moments he hadn't questioned before. Late nights studying, quiet dinners, the way she always said, "I'm fine," without looking up. She never complained, he said under his breath. Daniel's eyes softened slightly. Some kids learn that complaining doesn't change anything. 3 short sentences. Then silence. It was enough. The doctor cleared his throat. "We should proceed," he said, signaling to the nurse. Machines were adjusted. The bed shifted slightly. Movement returned to the room, but something about it felt off now. Not wrong, just incomplete. Daniel stepped back again, letting them work. Because sometimes stepping back is the loudest form of respect. That evening, long after the procedures had ended and the hospital lights dimmed into their quieter setting, Daniel returned home. The air inside the apartment was warm, carrying the faint smell of reheated soup. Lily sat at the table, her legs swinging slightly above the floor, a small notebook open in front of her. "You're late again," she said, but softer this time. Less waiting, more understanding. Daniel set his bag down. "Yeah." A pause, then honest. "Long day." He sat across from her, noticing the notebook. "What's that?" Lily hesitated, then turned it slightly toward him. "Just stuff." 2 words. Guarded. Familiar. Daniel didn't push. "Looks important." 3 words. Open. Then silence. Lily tapped her pencil lightly against the page. "We had to write about what we feel when something's too hard to say out loud," she murmured. Daniel leaned back slightly, giving her space without leaving. "That's a big assignment." Lily nodded. "Some kids wrote a lot." A pause. Then quieter. "I didn't." Daniel studied her for a moment. Not the page, but her. Did you wanna? He asked. Lily shrugged. I didn't know how. 3 words. Honest. Then the moment. Daniel reached for a blank piece of paper nearby, sliding it gently toward her. You don't have to use words, he said. Sometimes drawing says more. Lily looked at him, something shifting behind her eyes. Not fully open. Not yet. But closer. Back at the hospital, Emily lay in the same quiet stillness, surrounded by answers that weren't reaching her. But somewhere between a father learning to listen and a child learning to express, a bridge was beginning to form. Fragile, unseen, but real. And the difference between silence and healing was no longer as far apart as it seemed. She's still not responding. Not to voice, not to touch, not even to stimulation. The report came quietly, but it carried the kind of finality that made the room feel smaller, heavier, like hope itself was being measured and slowly running out. Richard Vance stood near the head of the bed, his fingers resting lightly against the edge, not gripping it anymore, just there, as if he had finally stopped trying to control what he couldn't. The doctor closed the chart with a soft tap. We've ruled out neurological decline, infection, trauma. At this point, we may need to consider long-term supportive care. 3 sentences. Clinical. Careful. Then the silence that followed. Richard didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on Emily, but something in his expression had changed. Not panic, not anger, but a kind of quiet resistance. No, he said finally, barely above a whisper. 2 letters. Then the shift. She's still in there. The doctor hesitated, then nodded slowly, though his eyes didn't fully agree. We'll continue to monitor, he said. And just like that, the room returned to its routine. But Richard didn't move. He didn't call another specialist. He didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, his posture lowering, his presence softening in a way it never had before. Hey, Em, he said gently. You don't have to be perfect right now. 3 short sentences. No expectation. No pressure. Then silence. Across the hall, Daniel paused. Mid-step, something about that tone catching his attention. He didn't look in immediately. He just listened. And for the first time, the silence coming from room 314 felt different. Not empty. Not closed. Just waiting. That evening, miles away, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor of their small living room, colored pencils scattered around her, the blank sheet Daniel had given her now filled with soft, careful strokes. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway, arms loosely crossed, not interrupting, not guiding, just present. You want to tell me about it? He asked after a while. Lily shook her head. Not yet. 2 words. Honest. Then the moment that mattered. Daniel nodded. Okay. No push. No follow-up. Just trust. Lily glanced up at him, a small smile forming, the kind that didn't need to be big to be real. But I will, she added quietly. And that was enough. Later, as he tucked her into bed, Lily reached out and held his hand a second longer than usual. Daddy, she whispered. Yeah. Do people stop talking because they're scared or because they're tired? The question hung there, soft but heavy with meaning. Daniel sat beside her, his voice calm. Sometimes both. 2 words. Then the truth. But when they feel safe again, they usually find their way back. Lily nodded slowly, her eyes closing as if that answer had settled something inside her. Back at the hospital, Richard sat in that same chair, the room dim now, the world outside fading into quiet. He hadn't spoken in a while. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was finally learning not to fill the space too quickly. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. You don't have to do this alone, he murmured. 3 soft sentences. Then stillness. And somewhere in that stillness, almost too small to notice, a finger twitched. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't enough to call a nurse. But it was there. A signal. A response. A beginning. And no one announced it. No machines changed. No alarms sounded. Because the most important shifts don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, in the exact moment someone finally feels safe enough to be seen. Did you see that? The whisper came sharp, almost breaking the careful quiet of the room, as Richard Vance leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on his daughter's hand like he had just witnessed something impossible. The nurse stepped closer, her movements quick but controlled. What happened? She asked, already checking the monitor out of instinct. Her finger, Richard said, his voice unsteady now. It moved. 3 short words. Then the moment stretched. The nurse glanced at Emily's hand, then back at the screen. No alarms. No spikes. No clinical confirmation. Just stillness again. It could have been a reflex, she said gently, not dismissing, but careful not to promise. But Richard didn't lean back. He didn't retreat into doubt. Not this time. No, he said quietly. 2 letters. Then the shift. She heard me. The nurse hesitated, just for a second longer than before, then nodded. Not agreement. Not denial. Just space. And sometimes that was enough. Outside the room, Daniel stood still, his cart untouched, his attention fixed on something deeper than what the eye could measure. He didn't rush in. He didn't interrupt. He simply allowed the moment to exist. Because moments like that, they didn't need noise. They needed room. Later that morning, the hospital felt different. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone could point to. But the air carried a subtle shift, like something unseen had begun to turn. The doctor returned, reviewing charts, scanning data. No significant changes, he said, almost automatically. 3 words. Routine. Then the quiet contradiction. Richard didn't argue. He didn't push back with frustration. He simply looked at him and said, "She's responding." The doctor paused, pen hovering slightly above the page. "We'll continue observation," he replied, but his tone had softened. Doubt had entered the room, not the kind that weakens, but the kind that opens. Miles away, in a small classroom filled with afternoon light and restless energy, Lily sat at her desk, her drawing folded neatly in front of her. The teacher walked by, pausing briefly. "Would you like to share today?" she asked again, her voice gentler this time. Lily looked down at the paper, her fingers tracing the edges. She hesitated. 3 seconds. 2 breaths. Then a choice. "Okay," she said quietly. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The class turned, some curious, some distracted. Lily stood slowly, her small hands holding the paper like it mattered. "It's about when someone feels left out," she began, her voice soft but steady. 3 sentences. Then the shift. And how it feels when someone notices. The room didn't laugh. No one interrupted. Even the loudest kid stayed quiet, just for a moment. And that moment, that was everything. Back at the hospital, Richard leaned closer to his daughter again, his voice softer now, more certain in its gentleness. "You don't have to stay quiet anymore," he said. 3 short sentences. No pressure. No demand. Then silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't closed. It was listening. Daniel stepped away slowly, returning to his work, his movements the same as always. But inside, he recognized the pattern. Not as a miracle, not as something magical, but as something deeply human. The beginning of safety. The return of trust. And as the day unfolded, no headlines were written, no announcements were made, no dramatic recovery took place. Just small changes. A softened breath. A flicker of movement. A father learning to listen. A child beginning to respond. And in a world that often looks for loud breakthroughs, the quiet ones were already rewriting everything. Sometimes the biggest miracle is simply being heard. The words settled gently into the quiet hospital room, not spoken aloud this time, but felt in the way everything had begun to change. Richard Vance sat closer than ever before, his chair pulled right beside the bed, his hand resting lightly over his daughter's. Not gripping, not urging, just there. The machines continued their steady rhythm, unchanged and different. But Emily wasn't the same. Her breathing had softened, no longer as rigid, no longer as distant. And then, slowly, almost like a memory returning, her fingers curled. This time not a reflex, not a twitch, but a response. "Emily," Richard whispered, his voice breaking just enough to reveal the weight behind it. 3 short words. Then the silence held. Her eyelids fluttered. Not fully open. Not yet. But enough. Enough to shift everything. A nurse stepped in quickly, her training taking over, checking vitals, calling for the attending physician. Footsteps approached. Voices rose slightly. But Richard didn't move. He didn't step back into panic. He stayed exactly where he was. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to rush back." 2 sentences. Then the moment. Emily's lips parted slightly, a faint breath escaping, not a word, but something closer to presence than absence. The doctor entered, scanning the monitors, then looking at the girl with something he hadn't shown before. uncertainty mixed with quiet respect. This is good, he said, his voice lower now, less certain of its own authority. No one mentioned tests. No one reached for explanations. Because what was happening didn't belong to charts. It belonged to something else. Outside the room, Daniel stood at a distance, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression unchanged but his eyes knowing. He didn't step forward. He didn't need recognition. Because this was never about being right. It was about something being restored. Later that evening, as the hospital settled into its quieter rhythm, Richard stepped out into the hallway, his shoulders no longer carrying the same invisible weight. He looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "I spent my whole life solving problems," he said quietly. "And I never realized she wasn't a problem to solve." 3 sentences. Honest. Then the shift. She just needed me to see her. Daniel gave a small nod. Nothing more. "You did," he said simply. And that was enough. No applause. No dramatic ending. Just understanding. Later, Daniel returned home a few miles away, in a small apartment filled with warm light and the quiet hum of evening. Daniel sat beside Lily on the couch. Her head rested gently against his arm, her drawing now unfolded between them. "Did you share it?" he asked softly. Lily nodded. "I was scared," she admitted. 2 words. Then the truth. But it felt better after. Daniel smiled faintly, his hand brushing lightly over her hair. "That's how it works," he said. "No lecture. Just certainty." Lily looked up at him. "Do people always come back?" she asked. Daniel paused, just for a second. "Not always right away," he answered. "But when they feel safe enough, they try." She nodded, settling back against him, her breathing slow, peaceful. And in that small moment, nothing looked extraordinary. No billion-dollar names. No hospital rooms. Just a father and a daughter, sitting in quiet understanding. Back at St. Matthew's, Emily Vance rested, not in silence, but in recovery. And for the first time, the room around her didn't feel like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of return. Because sometimes, the world doesn't change with noise or power or control. Sometimes, it changes when someone chooses to listen differently. So let me ask you this. How many voices in your life are still waiting to feel safe enough to be heard? And if a quiet story like this reminds you of the power of dignity, second chances, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, take a moment to like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because the most important stories are often the ones told in silence, and we're just getting started.